He must be removed before the council meets.
The Emperor suspects nothing.
Just imagine a courtroom gripped by fear. It's 1951. A judge is looking down, not at some hardened killer, but at this ordinary-looking couple from New York City. And his words just slice through the silence. He calls their crime worse than murder. He says they're the ones who unleashed a bloody war in Korea, that thousands of American lives were on their hands. You know, these chilling words didn't just seal the fate of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They lit the fuse on one of the most explosive and controversial trials in all of American history. This is the story of that trial, what many called the crime of the century. We're going to dig into how an ordinary couple became the face of a nation's deepest fears, and why, to this day, they remain the only American civilians ever put to death for espionage during the Cold War. All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll step into the atomic shadow of the Cold War, that climate of fear that made a spy hunt almost inevitable. Then, we'll pull back the curtain on the conspiracy of comrades at the heart of the ring and watch as the net closes in. We'll take you inside the courtroom for a trial in a time of fear before confronting that shocking sentence, the one deemed worse than murder. And finally, we'll look at the contested legacy, where secrets that were buried for decades would change everything we thought we knew. Look, to really get the Rosenberg case, you have to understand the world they were living in. The alliance from World War II shattered. In its place was this bitter ideological showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the dawn of the Cold War, and it was an era defined by suspicion, by paranoia, and by this terrifying new weapon that hung over the entire globe, the atomic bomb. And then, things started happening fast. In August 1949, the Soviets stunned the world. They tested their own atomic bomb, years before anyone in America thought possible. And the immediate question was, how? How did they do it? Espionage felt like the only possible answer. A few months later, China, the most populous country on Earth, falls to communism. And by the summer of 1950, American soldiers are fighting and dying in Korea. For a lot of Americans, it felt like the world was just spinning out of control, that this giant communist threat was closing in from all sides. This whole climate of fear, well, it has a name, the Second Red Scare. And this wasn't just a bad mood, it was a full-blown, systemic witch hunt. You had the House Un-American Activities Committee holding these televised hearings, just destroying people's careers. You had Senator Joseph McCarthy making these wild claims about communists in the State Department. And at the top, you had FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who made fighting communism his absolute top priority. The hunt for the Rosenbergs didn't happen in a vacuum. No, it happened at the absolute peak of this national paranoia. And right at the center of this storm were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. I mean, on the surface, they looked like any other couple from Manhattan's Lower East Side, raising their two little boys. But they'd been shaped by the Great Depression, and they had this deep ideological commitment. Both were passionate members of the Young Communist League. That's actually where they met back in '36. But then, in 1942, while he was working for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, Julius took that fateful step. He went from activist to spy, and began a secret life that would end up destroying him and his wife. So this was the network Julius built. He was the ringleader, codenamed Liberal by his Soviet handlers. And he wasn't just passing atomic secrets. No, he was funneling intelligence on cutting-edge radar, sonar, and this thing called the proximity fuse, a totally revolutionary device that let artillery shells explode in midair. His key guy for the atomic data was his own brother-in-law, David Greenglass, codenamed Caliber, a machinist working at the top-secret Los Alamos lab. The career tying it all together was a man named Harry Gold, codenamed Goose. And then there was Ethel. Her alleged role as an accomplice would become the single most explosive and debated part of this entire story. And the way they operated, I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. It was straight out of a spy novel. In early 1945, Julius gives David Greenglass one half of a Jell-O box top that he'd cut in a weird, irregular way. The other half, he said, would be brought by a courier to pick up the secrets. So that June, a man shows up at Greenglass's apartment in Albuquerque and says the code phrase, "Julius sent me." Greenglass gets his half of the box out of his wife's wallet. They hold them together, and they're a perfect match. The man was Harry Gold. He walked out of there with sketches of a high-explosive lens mold for the atomic bomb and a payment of $500. So how did this whole thing unravel? Well, it wasn't some brilliant piece of detective work by the FBI in New York. It actually started thousands of miles away, with the arrest of a man who turned out to be one of the most damaging spies of the entire 20th century.
It was like a chain reaction, a line of dominoes just waiting to fall. The first one tipped in February 1950. British intelligence arrests a physicist from the Manhattan Project, named Klaus Fuchs. He confesses to being a spy and names his American courier, Harry Gold. Domino number 2. The FBI grabs Gold, who also confesses, and he leads them to the machinist he met with the Jello box, David Greenglass. Domino number 3. And when Greenglass gets cornered, he gives up the last name, the man he says recruited him in the first place, his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. The final domino. And just look at how fast this all went down. In just 6 months, an investigation that started in England had worked its way all the way to a small apartment in Manhattan. Julius was arrested on July 17th, but he wouldn't talk. He refused to name anyone else in aspiring. So the FBI, they made a calculated and frankly a ruthless move. On August 11th, they arrested his wife Ethel, and they left their 2 young sons behind. The government's goal here was crystal clear: use her as leverage to make her husband crack.
The trial kicked off on March 6, 1951, and the atmosphere was just electric with fear. The Korean War was raging, Senator McCarthy was at the peak of his power, the Alger Hiss spy case had just ended in a conviction. It was in this superheated, politically charged environment that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, along with a co-defendant, Morton Sobel, had to face a jury. The charge? Conspiracy to commit espionage. The battle lines in that courtroom were drawn sharp and clear. In one corner, you had the prosecution, led by Irving Sapol and this young, aggressive lawyer named Roy Cohn. They painted a picture of these fanatical communists who had betrayed their own country and handed its ultimate weapon to the enemy. But the defense, led by Emanuel Bloch, they just hammered on one simple, powerful point. Where's the proof? There were no intercepted documents, no microfilm, 0 physical evidence linking the Rosenbergs to spying. The entire case, Bloch argued, was built on the words of self-confessed spies, like David Greenglass, who were just trying to get lighter sentences for themselves and their families.
But then came the moment that probably sealed Ethel's fate. Her own brother, David Greenglass, gets on the witness stand and points the finger right at his sister. He testified that he saw Ethel sitting at a typewriter in their New York apartment, typing up his handwritten notes about the atomic bomb. It was this devastating, cinematic moment of betrayal, a brother condemning his own sister to save his own skin. But here's the twist. The absolute bombshell that the jury and the world wouldn't know for 50 years was that this crucial piece of testimony was a lie. In 2001, David Greenglass finally came clean. He admitted he had committed perjury. He said he never saw Ethel type any notes. He lied under oath, he explained, because he was being pressured by the prosecution to protect his own wife, Ruth, who he claimed was the one who actually did the typing. This one admission, coming half a century too late, completely demolishes the main piece of evidence used to convict Ethel Rosenberg.
And the perjured testimony was just the tip of the iceberg. The more you look, the messier this trial gets. We now know that the judge, Irving Kaufman, was having these secret, improper talks with the prosecution the whole time, especially about the sentencing. Assistant prosecutor Roy Cohn later bragged that he'd personally made sure Kaufman got the case and had directly pushed him to impose the death penalty. This wasn't justice in a vacuum. It was a process that was deeply, deeply tainted by the politics of the era and by some really serious misconduct from the judge and the prosecution. So on March 29th, 1951, after only about 8 hours, the jury comes back. The verdict: guilty. All that was left was the sentence. The defendants, their lawyers, they were all expecting long prison terms. But nobody, absolutely nobody, was prepared for what the judge was about to say. Judge Kaufman bringing up the Korean War and blaming the Rosenbergs for the deaths of thousands of American soldiers sentenced both Julius and Ethel to die in the electric chair. The sentence was just staggering in its severity. I mean, this was a peacetime crime. The US wasn't at war with the Soviet Union. The punishment was completely unprecedented, and it still is. They are the only American civilians ever executed for espionage, period. For the next 2 years, the Rosenbergs sat on death row at Sing Sing prison while this desperate legal battle and a worldwide campaign for clemency just raged on. Appeal after appeal was denied. Then, just 2 days before the execution, a tiny glimmer of hope. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas grants a stay. But it was just fleeting. The full Supreme Court called a special, totally unprecedented session, and they vacated the stay. On the evening of June 19th, 1953, maintaining their innocence right to the very end, Julius and then Ethel Rosenberg were executed. You'd think the executions would be the end of the story, but in a way, it was just the beginning. For decades, the Rosenberg case was this bitter ideological battleground. Were they innocent martyrs framed by a paranoid government, or were they guilty traitors who got what they deserved? The debate just raged on, mostly because there was no definitive proof. Then, in the 1990s, the Cold War ended, and the old Soviet archives started to open up. So, after all these years, what's the answer to that big question? Were they guilty? Well, the evidence that's come out since then forces us to throw away a simple yes or no. The truth, like it so often is in history, is way more nuanced, and honestly, it's pretty unsettling for both sides of the argument. The biggest breakthrough by far came in 1995 with the release of something called the Venona Project. These were intercepted Soviet intelligence cables from the 1940s, and what they showed was incredible. They both confirmed and contradicted the government's case. The cables proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Julius Rosenberg was a Soviet spy. He had the codename Liberal, and he was the head of a productive spy ring. But those same cables had a glaring omission. Ethel Rosenberg was never assigned a codename, and in the super bureaucratic world of Soviet intelligence, that's powerful evidence that she just wasn't considered an active agent.
So this is what it all boils down to, this stark contrast. On one hand, you have the crime. Julius Rosenberg was a dedicated spy who gave the Soviets valuable military secrets. Though it's worth noting that even General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, thought the atomic data he passed on was of minor value. Ethel's conviction, meanwhile, was built on a foundation of lies. Now, on the other hand, look at the punishment. A death sentence for both of them, born out of the hysteria of the Red Scare, pushed by a zealous prosecution and handed down by a biased judge. The punishment seems wildly out of proportion with the crime, especially in Ethel's case.
And that leaves us right here, with this final, really troubling question. The historical record is clear. Julius Rosenberg was guilty of being a spy. But the execution of his wife, Ethel, a mother of two, convicted based on her own brother's perjury in a trial that was riddled with misconduct and political pressure, that forces us to ask a totally different question. Was this an act of justice, or was it a tragic and irreversible casualty of a nation that was completely gripped by Cold War fear? The answer is something that continues to haunt the American conscience.